Kia ora everybody, to this panel discussion on Hong Kong and in particular on where it's heading in the light of recent developments. Of course, this has been a week of focus on domestic matters, and I think we just take a moment to pause to think of those who either lost their lives or lost loved ones on Whakaari, White Island, and those too who went selflessly to their rescue. On behalf of the President of the New Zealand Institute of International Affairs, Sir Anand Sachinand, thanks for accepting the invitation this evening. The meeting tonight, which is the last event for the National Office this year, is being held in conjunction with the New Zealand Contemporary China Research Centre, which is based at the university, and we're delighted to be partnering with them for this evening's event. The Centre's chair, Tony Brown, and its director, Jason Young, are both, as it happens, currently overseas, but the Centre is extremely well represented through its associate director and one of tonight's panellists. Brian Moloughney, who is Professor of Chinese History at Otago University, has held senior positions at the university while continuing to pursue a number of research interests that include, amongst other things, how historians have been reassessing the Chinese contribution to world history. Professor Moloughney will set some of the scene by way of explaining how Hong Kong has found itself politically and otherwise in this situation today, flowing from the 1984 Joint Declaration and the beginning of the 50-year one country, two systems clock that started ticking in 1997. He's very familiar with China generally. Indeed, I was counting up, and amongst us all, there are over 30 years' experience of having lived in Hong Kong or on the mainland, and dating back in one case to the late 70s. And in the audience, I can see a number of others who have also lived in Hong Kong or in China over the years. A slightly more recent Hong Kong dweller is Ambassador Clifford Hart, who served a number of times in China, most recently as US Consul General in Hong Kong from 2013 to 16. He lived through the Occupy Central Troubles of 2014 that were in some way, perhaps or perhaps not, a foretaste of the events of this year. Ambassador Hart is a member of the US Council on Foreign Relations and a frequent speaker on China and North Asia matters. And he's going to focus on some of the current issues besetting the Hong Kong SAR. This week, as you will no doubt know, marks 6 months since the beginning of the latest round of protests. Of course, while all the panellists will be keen to set out their views on the implications of recent events for Hong Kong itself, is it the end of the liberal autocracy? Will complete annexation be held at bay until 2047? There are questions to be asked about the impact on Hong Kong's neighbours, including Taiwan, Singapore, and more broadly. The flight of people and of capital from one of the world's leading financial centres has been well documented. Confidence, however, is said to be waning. As to how this might impact on New Zealand, Mark Russell, a strategic communications specialist and the owner of the PR firm Hot Metal Communications, and the immediate past president of the Hong Kong New Zealand Businesses Association, will offer some thoughts and conclusions. I had the pleasure of meeting Mark in the late 90s when he was assistant foreign editor of Hong Kong's South China Morning Post at the time that I was on assignment there as Consul General. So I can assure you we have a very experienced panel here this evening. Once each of the panellists have made some opening remarks, I'll check with them whether they want to question each other before opening the floor for the remaining time available for questions from the floor. You will note that the session is being recorded and it will be available on the Institute website in due course. So let's start with Professor Moloughney and perhaps the Joint Declaration of 1984, that legally binding and UN-registered document, Brian. A flawed document? I don't know. You'll tell us. Welcome to the stage. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, well, thank you. And as James said, as the historian here, I'm supposed to provide some context for the contemporary situation. But because it's such a complex situation, it's quite difficult actually to know where to start to tell that story. But I think the protest movement that engulfed Chinese cities in 1989 really marked a crucial transition in the way that people in Hong Kong came to understand their future. I mean, there had been, of course, a great deal of anxiety in the period leading up to the signing of the Sino-British Joint Declaration in 1984. But with the commitment made by the Chinese Communist Party to allow Hong Kong to enjoy, in that famous phrase, a high degree of autonomy, many people believed that, all things considered, this was probably as good an arrangement as was possible. Margaret Thatcher famously called Deng Xiaoping's conception, one country, two systems, an imaginative concept. For China, it ensured a formal end to the era of what the Chinese call national humiliation, which of course began in 1840-42 with the British acquisition of Hong Kong. So it marked a formal but also a highly symbolic end to that era, albeit allowing a transition period to full integration of Hong Kong into the People's Republic. For the British, it enabled sovereignty to be transferred while maintaining Hong Kong's existing institutions into the foreseeable future, and thus helped absolve them of any thought that they were simply abandoning the people of Hong Kong. So China emphasised the one country aspect, Britain emphasised the two systems, and through that an agreement was reached. The people of Hong Kong, of course, had no voice in that process and simply had to accept the agreement. But as China gradually codified the joint declaration into the basic law over the next few years, they tried to be hopeful that this would provide a legal guarantee for the preservation of those things that made Hong Kong distinct. At the same time, Hong Kong was benefiting substantially from the startling economic growth that was beginning to occur in China as a result of the reform and opening era initiated by Deng Xiaoping. Larry Fane, a cartoonist for the South China Morning Post, cynically summed up the attitude of some in Hong Kong with the phrase, "Let's all just shut up and make money." But then came the upheaval of 1989. And during the early stages of the protest movement, Hong Kong people were hugely optimistic that this marked the potential for change in China, and they contributed funds and resources to support the protesters. But the CCP's reaction quickly eroded that optimism. The day after martial law was imposed in Beijing on the 21st of May, 600,000 people took to the streets in Hong Kong to express their support for the protesters. A week later, that number rose to 1.5 million, the largest public demonstration in Hong Kong's history to that point. And many of those people carried banners conveying their fears, banners that read, "China today, tomorrow, Hong Kong." So when Chris Patten arrived in 1992 to become the last British governor, he responded to these concerns by attempting to entrench the Bill of Rights ordinance, but also by making the Hong Kong government more accountable, extending the franchise and enhancing the power of the Legislative Council. But the CCP saw these things as contrary to the spirit of the Joint Declaration and to the Basic Law, and simply rolled them back after the handover in 1997. I mean, as the party sees it, the Basic Law was promulgated by China and can only be interpreted by China through the National People's Congress. And that view was reinforced by a number of China's actions in the immediate post-handover period. Perhaps most significantly when the State Council and the NPC overrode a decision made by Hong Kong's Court of Final Appeal regarding the right of abode of children born on the mainland to parents who had permanent residency in Hong Kong. And that intervention basically undermined the independence of the Hong Kong legal system, just as the extradition bill would have done. But it was just one of a number of examples that occurred in the immediate post-handover period that indicated that, Beijing was enforcing the one country principle over any commitment to respecting two systems. At the same time, the Chinese Communist Party reinforced the authority of the executive, and especially the chief executive, over that of the legislature, thereby enhancing its ability to exert control. But the Basic Law does state that the ultimate aim is for the chief executive to be selected through a process of universal suffrage. And it's this part of the Basic Law that has been at the crux of most of the protests in recent years, especially since the Umbrella Movement in 2014. I mean, Hong Kong people want that ultimate aim to be realised. They want to be able to elect the people who govern them. In contrast, the Chinese Communist Party wants control over Hong Kong's administration to remain in the hands of the pro-Beijing business elite. Despite this strengthening of control through the executive, public protest has sometimes proved an effective way of resisting unwanted change, as was the case in 2003 when hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets to oppose the introduction of anti-subversion legislation, and which led to the resignation of the then chief executive, Tung Chee-hwa. And again in 2012 when Joshua Wong led a campaign to protest the introduction of the so-called moral and national education curriculum with its much more explicitly pro-China nationalist focus. In both cases, the Beijing government, the Hong Kong governments were unable to force through changes in the face of widespread public opposition. And of course, the most recent protests have seen the withdrawal of the proposed extradition legislation. There's a view amongst some people that if the Chinese government would just return to working within the fundamental principles set out in the Joint Declaration and in the Basic Law, then the majority of Hong Kong people would fall into line and the energy behind the protest movement would simply dissipate. But I think things have moved well beyond that now. A very different view, for instance, can be found in a new bilingual journal that sprung up in the last few months called Lao San, or Dispersed Umbrellas, compiled by activists who had been part of the Umbrella Movement. And they emphasise long-term economic issues sitting underneath the current protests. For instance, they note that the monthly rental fee for nearly half of Hong Kong flats is more than 200,000 Hong Kong dollars, which is more than 70% of the median income of households in Hong Kong. So they argue that there's a continuity between the colonial and the Chinese periods. It's just these things have become more pronounced. The disparity between rich and poor has got worse. The monopoly of land ownership by a small group of business people continues, and of course those people are the people that dominate the Hong Kong administration. So I think that these long-term economic issues need to be taken into consideration, but at the same time I think any explanation of the current turmoil needs to address the deep-seated concern that Hong Kong people have about the nature of CCP rule throughout China. I mean, back in 1984, some people argued that the Joint Declaration and the Basic Law were simply Hong Kong's version of the 17-point agreement, which the Chinese Communist Party had signed with the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan leadership after the People's Liberation Army moved into Tibet in 1951. That agreement stipulated that Tibetan people retained the right to exercise regional autonomy, while the CCP committed itself to not altering the existing political situation, the political structure in Tibet. And in addition, they committed themselves to respecting the religious beliefs, the customs and the habits of the Tibetan people. So while associating the Basic Law, the Joint Declaration, with the 17-point agreement was a marginal position in 1984, many people in Hong Kong now look at the way that the Communist Party treats Chinese citizens in Tibet, in Xinjiang, and they see their future. So instead of embracing the diversity of China as an asset, the Communist Party has increasingly resorted to suppression of difference. attacks on language and culture are at the heart of the program to control Xinjiang and Tibet. And these are also concerns that are central to the Hong Kong protests. Maintenance of the Cantonese language, the use of full-form characters, as well as retention of Cantonese cultural traditions are as important to the protest movement, I think, as demands that Beijing respects the commitments made in the Basic Law to ensure that Hong Kong retains a high degree of autonomy. One last factor I think that's at play here is a generational divide. Many of the older people came into Hong Kong fleeing China and were prepared to just keep their head down and not get involved in political issues. A younger generation have a very different view of how they should behave, but I think others will talk more about that generational split. So thank you.
Thanks, Brian, for giving us some of the context, which I think is really important for a helpful discussion on Hong Kong. And we'll clearly come back to some of the economic imperatives later on. Ford, a magazine in your home country, the New York Review of Books, spoke about the death throes of a great city. Is this what's happening? Come and tell us. Thank you.
Thank you, James. That sets this up to be non-controversial. Yeah. Kia ora, 欢迎各位, 歡迎各位. Thank you for being here this evening. James has asked me to speak to three issues in about 10 minutes, sort of Hong Kong, the domestic situation in Hong Kong, the regional response to Hong Kong, and sort of global youth as represented in Hong Kong. So I'll toss a bunch of stuff out at you and we'll see where it goes. Delighted, of course, in question and answer to expand on any of these or to follow the issues you might like. Starting on the domestic situation, just a few broad thoughts. So first of all, Brian's introduction, extraordinarily useful, sets the base. I'm better than I could ever have done it because I'm not a historian. I'm just a former diplomat who sort of troops through things. I would emphasize a few points when we talk about the domestic situation in Hong Kong, all of which are kind of obvious, but I think it's really important to emphasize them. One is we're talking about a polity of 7.5 million people that is a sovereign part of a massive country of 1.4 billion. Hong Kong's domestic context implicitly involves the country of the People's Republic of China, and particularly the Central Party leadership in Beijing. I'd emphasize there's a profound expectations gap between the average person on the streets in Hong Kong and that Central Party leadership. It's almost impossible to exaggerate. These are really ships passing in the night. You have people in Hong Kong, most of whom have grown up and are used to living in a liberal, law-based, open society. And you have a Central Party leadership at the top, which is the apex of a massive Leninist police state that manages an enormous, complicated country going through profound change. And it's very as a result, there's almost complete lack of comprehension at times. Expectations gap is equally as large. Final point I just want to make is that I would argue that we're in a period of fundamental change in Hong Kong on the order of perhaps what we haven't seen since the early 1950s. It dates not from 2014 when the first big demonstrations occurred, the umbrella movement, nor 1997 when reversion happened. I would date it to 2012 when the 18th Party Congress brought in the current Chinese leadership, which came with a very different view on one country, two systems, as it had different views on other aspects of Chinese foreign policy. We've seen quite a significant change in Chinese policy in key areas across the board. Hong Kong is not different. I assume that everybody's been following the news, so I'm not going to go through the last 6 months. Let me just toss out ideas about where we are in the interest of time. We're in a lull right now since the crescendo last month of the siege at Polytechnic University, the remarkable elections to the district council at the end of November. This is an indeterminate duration, but it'll certainly end at some point. The basics are still in place. The Hong Kong government is not being responsive on key demands of the demonstrators. It will not be responsive to those demands because it's operating, I think, on a very short leash. It doesn't have these things in its gift that the demonstrators, the protesters, and many Hong Kong people want. Protesters naturally are resentful, frustrated, and concerned. I think that's not going to go away anytime soon. An important figure I'd want to mention, though, we've heard about how in these district council elections, pan-democratic parties took over 17 of the 18 district councils, whereas in the past, the pro-establishment parties had controlled the majority of those district councils. It's a remarkable result, it's a remarkable turnout. It's a very important statement of dissatisfaction by the average Hong Kong person with the Hong Kong government and with the situation. One figure that is not, I think, frequently or sufficiently emphasized, though, is 40% of Hong Kong voters in this historic turnout voted for pro-establishment parties. It's a very significant number, and I think it's really important to bear it in mind, because what we have in Hong Kong is it's a complex political continuum. It's often oversimplified into pro and anti-Beijing elements, and I think that's really does a disservice to the sophistication of the Hong Kong people. I'm going to step perhaps a little bit on Mark's feet here just briefly, though. With Hong Kong, and what I would say in brief is there's no happy ending here. The Hong Kong people, those who demand things like true universal, genuine universal suffrage and other points, are going to be frustrated. I think also it is likely that Hong Kong's autonomy will continue to be eroded in the years ahead. The $64,000 question, or questions which cannot be answered, however, are how will it be eroded and to what extent? And those are profoundly important questions. And because of the way I assume things will go, I don't assume Hong Kong's demise, and I would urge you not to as well. It has a lot of problems, it's facing a lot of challenges, but crucially, Beijing wants it to succeed. I think Beijing is perfectly happy for Hong Kong to operate within a framework that is relatively autonomous. It would involve doing things in many ways in a different way from the rest of the country. I don't see Hong Kong becoming just another Chinese city anytime soon. What Beijing doesn't want is political surprises or unacceptable political behavior, and there's a problem there, because that sort of stuff just happens in an open liberal society. People will say things, even if they're a tiny minority, a Feichong, an extremely small minority. It will still get up Beijing's nose, as it were. But Beijing, at the end of the day, does want Hong Kong to succeed, and that's important. They have an interest in it succeeding. Secondly, the Hong Kongers are exceptionally resilient. These are tough people. It's really important to bear in mind that back in 1949, 1950, nobody saw the Hong Kong of today. This was the least likely outcome of that time, and somehow it came along. That's because of the remarkable people of Hong Kong, and other factors that worked in their favor as well. And those, in addition, those innate advantages that Hong Kong has. I mean, wonderful geographic location, that's not changing. Remarkable first-class infrastructure, highly trained people, access to the extraordinary market in the People's Republic of China. That ain't going to go away. Now, regional consequences, all right, obviously varied. I'm going to make an assumption that the most, what I consider the more likely scenario is what's going to bear out, which is no mainland military intervention. That would be sort of the worst case scenario. Things just the Hong Kong police force falls apart, or things are going really crazy, and Beijing decides to send in the People's Armed Police or the People's Liberation Army. Don't think it's going to happen. Not impossible, but unlikely, I think. I think that's not going to happen, and I think the process of change in Hong Kong will be, on the whole, gradual. Given those assumptions, I think we'll see most of the countries in the region, particularly non-democratic states, sort of doing what they're already doing, which is this balancing act. Most countries in Asia are trying to find some way to take advantage of the opportunities of this massive country, this emerged China, while at the same time hedging against the downsides of dealing with that China. I think they will look at what happens in Hong Kong and just factor that into this broader process of planning for ongoing balancing act. Singapore is important in the sense that if Hong Kong's commercial appeal does decline, as it declines, then Singapore is likely to be a beneficiary. Then it's the natural place for companies, international companies, and even Chinese companies to move to if they want to have a real access to a reliable court system, and they're not confident the financial system will work like it used to. Singapore could do rather well, to be seen. The United States, other democratic states in the region are going to have a watching brief. We all have our policies. We just got a new law in the United States all of our governments simply got to follow what happens in Hong Kong. We'll implement those as we go along. The one place that I will watch with particular concern is Taiwan, and you just referred to, what do you all refer to it? If Beijing comes out of the Hong Kong experience profoundly soured on one country, two systems, will that militate towards will it change in Beijing's approach towards Taiwan? It's useful to bear in mind that the Chinese invented one country, two systems for Taiwan. Taiwan said, we don't want it. So they applied it to Hong Kong. And I think the argument that taking care of Hong Kong with some appeal to Taiwan lost a lot of its appeal in Beijing probably 10 or 15 years ago at the latest. But just saying it's important, and as an intellectual and policy construct, if they no longer are enthusiastic, if they disbelieve in it, what do they do with regard to Chinese behavior towards Taiwan? That's a thing to watch. Finally, this question of the youth, the Hong Kong youth in a global context. And I think it was a really important question to raise, James, because I've been saying this about Hong Kong continuously. I was there in 2014 during the umbrella movement. And one of the things that struck me then was that, and I've lived in the mainland several times, was that the young people of Hong Kong are vastly more like the young people of New Zealand or Europe or Canada or the United States, and they are like the tens of hundreds of millions of young people right over the border in the PRC. Culturally, it's essentially the same culture, linguistically deeply related, all of these things. But their assumptions, their sense of what is normal is just fundamentally different. They, by dint of how they've grown up and therefore what's normal to them, they assume an open society. They assume limited government. They assume rights of assembly and speech. They enjoy an unfettered online life, which gives them access to new ideas and trends around the planet, and a remarkable capacity for organization and coordination among themselves, which we've seen demonstrated in the last 6 months. In a local context, one thing that strikes me about the many young people in Hong Kong, it struck me in 14, continues to now, is this paradoxical ignorance of the central government and how it operates among a lot of the young people. Not all by any means, but I don't see a theory of case. How does this work? What do you expect to get out of Beijing, and how, and what are they likely to provide? And I, having spent a good chunk of my adult life living in mainland China, look at protests, especially violent protests, and think that's not going to help the case. Now, I'm always torn about this because this is a free polity and it is the right of people to express their views. But Beijing, I think, has merely had its views about Hong Kong reinforced by events of the last 5 years. They already have a plan. They will pursue that plan, I think, and continue to in the future. That said, I think as long as Hong Kong remains a relatively open society with some rights of freedom of speech and assembly, Beijing will be frustrated in that regard. People will continue to express their views as people do in free and open societies. Beijing is going to have a very hard time changing the youth mindset in Hong Kong. We've already heard once again, a lot of calls for the introduction of patriotic education, as they call it in the PRC. Making sure the kids in Hong Kong receive their version of reality. Fine. The introduction of that will be controversial. It will be resisted, and it will prompt protests of its own. I think the reality is that, given the perspective of youth in Hong Kong, that simply introducing a different curriculum without the rest of the control apparatus that a Leninist state gives to you, which the mainland has in the rest of the country, simply is not going to be sufficient. And what we're going to see, because of that and many other reasons, is continuing periodic youth protests in Hong Kong almost indefinitely. We're certainly in a sort of new normal now going forward, and the frequency and the scale of the youth protests will vary over time. Impossible to predict, but it's not going to go away. Last point, I think, is an ongoing problem. I think I referred to it earlier, though, is that extreme voices are in a free society, which Hong Kong remains, are problematic in a Leninist state like in the PRC, the rest of the country, the PRC. The 2014, when the umbrella movement started right up, I was talking to mainland officials in Hong Kong the first week, and they zeroed in on the handful of voices then calling for Hong Kong independence. It flies against the fundamental Chinese policy of national unity. You wouldn't tolerate calls for independence anywhere else in the country. And I was trying to tell them, look, and we've got flat Earth societies in the West and things like that. Don't worry about this too much. These local guys were channeling Beijing's concerns. And to the extent you have a tiny number of people in Hong Kong calling for independent Hong Kong or a downfall of the Communist Party, that's going to go right into Beijing's reptile brain and irritate them profoundly. And it's going to happen. It's just going, as long as Hong Kong is an open and free society, you will see that. In fact, the more the pressure goes on, the more that is likely to happen. So we have this profound dilemma that's going to be in place. I don't think it's going to be resolved anytime soon. The fundamental reason why I think Beijing would prefer not to send the troops in and take over the place is they don't want to own the mess. They know ultimately that it's a difficult situation. It can't be fixed in the short term. They believe time is on their side. And for a range of reasons, it's wiser for them simply to ride this out. And I think that's exactly what they will do. Thank you all very much.
Thanks very much, Ford. I think apart from some of the earlier comments, which were also valuable, I think that the reminder at the end of your words about Hong Kong youth, for those, if I dare sort of look around the audience and think of those who have lived through Hong Kong in the 70s, 80s and 90s, a reminder that not only a lot of the people on the street not around at the time of the signing of the Joint Declaration, and they were not around even in 1997 when the clock started ticking. So one begins to understand some of the other complexities of the problem. Speaking of problems, what about business, Mark? Is it time for business to pack its bags and move to Singapore? The floor's yours.
Well, good evening, everyone. Joe Sana, ni hao. When James Kember invited me to speak tonight, he told me these events were quite small affairs, 30 to 40 people max. But a bit like Hong Kong Chief Executive Carrie Lam, it seems he's totally underestimated the passion that exists for Hong Kong. But I'd like to begin by pointing out, while I'm going to be looking at some of the economic impacts caused by the protests, I'm not an economist nor a business analyst. So keep that in mind when it comes to the question and answer sessions if you want any sensible responses out of me. But I do know Hong Kong well. I lived there for 5 years, working for the South China Morning Post and the Hong Kong Tourism Board. I'm also, as James said, the immediate past president of the Hong Kong New Zealand Business Association. I visit Hong Kong often and I follow its unfolding events very closely, including on a number of private social media feeds. When I told one Hong Kong Kiwi friend last night about the speech I was giving this evening, his response was, and I quote, "Please mention the dehumanising of the people and the protesters. There are many instances that make me want to get out on the streets and demonstrate." And this is a senior journalist who's lived there 25 years, obviously can't do that. But he went on to say, "The day the teenager died after falling from a car park in a police clearance operation, a police officer was captured on video yelling, 'Cockroaches, go home and spawn. Come back tomorrow and we will fight you again. But tonight we celebrate with champagne.'" Of course, there's unacceptable behaviour on both sides of the Hong Kong divide and innocent victims. Hong Kong now has the police force thrown, perhaps unfairly, into a political maelstrom and demonised to the extent that the wives of some police officers are reportedly talking about divorce because their children are being victimised so badly at school. Hong Kong now appears trapped in a stalemate with no solution in sight. The territory is in recession. Retail sales slumped by just over 25% in October, and thousands of retail job losses and store closures are expected. Tourist arrivals have fallen by more than 40%. Manufacturing is also well down, and analysts predict restaurant profits could fall by 30%. Even its ever-reliable MTR Metro company, a regular target of some of the radical protesters, has revealed it faces losses in New Zealand dollars of around 310 million. And despite the world's largest listing of 2019, the Alibaba Group Holdings' second IPO, finally going ahead last month, the Hang Seng Index remains volatile and international managers are advising caution. A woman named Tara Joseph, who's president of the American Chamber of Commerce in Hong Kong, said just over a week ago, "It will take months to restore confidence in many aspects of the economy. The city's global reputation has been tarnished and we need to actively show that change is afoot to restore peace, security and a solution to the ills affecting society." Well, last weekend, Miss Joseph was refused entry into Macau when she travelled there for a social function. No reason was given and she was forced to return to Hong Kong. The US-China trade war is also hitting Hong Kong hard. Unless the deal is agreed by this weekend, new US tariffs could kick in on smartphones, toys and consumer goods. That's likely to lead to lower volumes of trade passing through Hong Kong, which will further impact many employed in trade-related industries. The retail slump is also affecting the luxury end of the retail market. Even luxury brand stores are demanding landlords reduce their rent. Widespread store closures and redundancies are expected. Not surprisingly, Hong Kong's conference and events sector is also feeling the pain. Attendance at trade exhibitions has fallen by more than 20%, and some trade shows and exhibitions have been postponed or cancelled. The tourism slump, I think, is particularly significant because the sector has been facing many challenges in recent years. Arrivals from mainland China have been booming, and Chinese tourists now account for nearly 80% of international arrivals, and that's changing the face of Hong Kong tourism sector. At the same time, the number of non-Chinese visitors in recent years has stagnated or declined. Compared to the heady days soon after the handover, which is when I lived in Hong Kong, some would argue that Hong Kong now feels about as exciting as the Chinese provincial capital. Most New Zealand exports to Hong Kong are retail or tourism related: fresh produce, seafood, wines, dairy. A New Zealand Trade and Enterprise contact told me yesterday that many New Zealand exporters he's in contact with say they have been significantly affected by the downturn. However, he did say that others have yet to experience any negative impact, although they are increasingly concerned. The slowing Hong Kong economy is also affecting outbound travel. Statistics New Zealand reports a 7.1 fall in visitor arrivals from Hong Kong in the year ended September. Writing recently for the Asia Media Centre, Asian investment advisor Andrew Sayers said he sees both risks and opportunities for New Zealand as the protests rumble on. He said Hong Kong's real estate market has cooled significantly. His clients are struggling to sell residential property, even at a 20 to 25% discount on the market value just 6 months ago. And here's what Andrew had to say about the potential opportunities for New Zealand. "I'm experiencing increased interest from Hong Kong residents for New Zealand investment and migration opportunities. Commonly requested investments include residential property developments, agricultural assets, commercial property and hotels, food and beverage, and nutraceuticals." On the immigration front, Andrew went on, Immigration New Zealand is fielding significantly more inquiries from Hong Kong nationals, and that applications for New Zealand investor visas are up on recent years. And Andrew concluded his article by writing, "While it is sad to witness the recent events in Hong Kong, and it will represent a more challenging market to New Zealand exporters, I believe it offers an opportunity for New Zealand to attract additional Hong Kong source capital, which ultimately will further New Zealand's economic growth." Now, everyone's got their own views on what might happen next. The reality is, of course, it's almost impossible to predict. But for what it's worth, here's my take. There are no signs of the movement waning, as last weekend's massive street march showed. The protests continue to draw networks of peaceful people as well as more radical protesters. My Hong Kong contacts tell me about scouts who share the details about police movements on social media, drivers who transport protesters home, first aid workers who treat the wounded not only on the front line but in secret surgeries, and office workers and students who guide crowds during protests. Many protesters, especially the young, believe this is a fight they cannot walk away from because their very future is at stake. Of the 6,000 or so people arrested since the protest began, about 40% are students. The youngest person arrested was only 11 years old. I personally believe what started as a protest about the extradition bill was always going to morph into a backlash against the dismal economic prospects so many young, educated Hong Kong people face. And of course they fear for their futures as the freedoms they currently enjoy are slowly eroded. The Hong Kong many tourists see is a city of glitz and glamour, luxury shopping malls, bustling nightlife and upmarket restaurants. But the reality of life for many Hong Kong people is one of struggle. Hong Kong is one of the most expensive places in the world to live. Young adults, many not even born at the time of the handover, face a future of high student loans and apartments they simply can't afford to rent, even if they can find one available. And although the recession and the protests are hitting many locals hard, I believe that they're prepared to endure that pain. They simply don't see Carrie Lam as willing or able to solve this crisis. The recent elections, I think, really boiled down to a vote of confidence on Lam's leadership, and it's a vote she failed miserably. I believe her days as chief executive are probably numbered, and that it's only a matter of time before she's axed by Beijing. I don't see a strong armed response from mainland China happening anytime soon, because it's hard to see an upside to them sending in the PLA. Unless the violence on the streets escalates, I think they will continue to play a waiting game. But if they don't, the outcome, of course, would be catastrophic. Sadly, to my eyes, Hong Kong has reached an impasse that neither side can win without making concessions they simply aren't prepared to make. And that means it's an impasse that neither side appears prepared to lose. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. It's an interesting commentary, isn't it, that of all the chief executives, only one went full term, and then wasn't Siwai Leung wasn't re-elected. Tung Chee Hwa out. Donald Zhang, well, less said the better, and Carrie Lam's got her hands tied behind her back. Do you have any questions for each other, or should we just sort of go to the?
Well, maybe I can ask
Yep.
forward. Was it on? Yeah. You said that you don't see Hong Kong just becoming another Chinese city anytime soon, but I mean, the plan is for Hong Kong just to be one part of this greater Bay Area that will become less and less significant as the cities around the region grow in significance, and the region itself become sort of, the dominant part, with Hong Kong as only a small and increasingly less significant part of that. From what you suggest, that won't happen quickly. Is that what your reading of it? Mm.
Well, that is my reading, and for a variety of reasons. I mean, first, I said anytime soon. If we're talking over decades, that's a different game. I can't speak to what happens in 2047. We don't appreciate the fundamental significances, as it were, of the differences of an open, liberal, law-based society like Hong Kong is from the rest of the country. I mean, put Hong Kong aside for a second. People's Republic of China is a large police state, obviously, but it's organized around Leninist lines, which is significant. This is a kind of public administration which penetrates all levels of society, squeezes out civil society, associates all organizations of any significant size with the party. People are not robots. There's been an extraordinary change in mainland China in the last 40 years. It's really quite remarkable. But just the same, that structure is in place. And that permits the regime in Beijing to do all kinds of things. We've seen the leadership in Beijing since 2012 dial back up the Leninist structure. It was all there. It was always a place that never went away. It's much more active now and using it in all kinds of remarkable ways, as we're seeing in Xinjiang and with the Feng Chao experience movement and all these things right now. That's one point. Another point I would toss out, looking into Hong Kong, well, part of that same point with Hong Kong is you have, we look at Hong Kong, we see a place that's culturally Chinese. It's inhabited by Chinese people, but it is an open, liberal society with a dynamic civil society in it. In fact, arguably, this is as China. I often say Hong Kong is more Chinese for me than the rest of China is. You have healthy, pre-modern, traditional Chinese culture living on in Hong Kong in a way that in many ways has been obliterated on the mainland and it continues to be suppressed whenever it pops its head back up. It's alive in Hong Kong. Beyond that, institutionally, Hong Kong has these first-rate institutions, public institutions left in place, governmental institutions left in place by the Chinese, the British government in 1997. Their various departments of customs, of immigration, of education just operate differently than they do in the mainland. If the mainland rather has to permit these institutions to operate and function well without excessive intervention, or that will throw them out of kilter. If it wants them simply to become part of the Chinese system, it has to absorb them into the system, and that will be seen. I mean, customs just doesn't overnight turn into a Chinese institution, that's part of the Haiguan system. And you got this repeated across the board with institutions in Hong Kong that I think have a high level of integrity and must be let to operate, or you'll have a level of institutional failure the mainland doesn't want. And my final point I would toss out is a favorite one, which is where those of us who serve in Hong Kong. I was the U.S. Consul General to Macau as well as to Hong Kong, and of course we beat conceptually, Macau is really under Beijing's thumb. Yeah, Beijing took over Macau in 1967. All these sorts of things you say, but the reality, if you go over to Macau, is that Macau is still a very different place from any Chinese city you would go to. So if that's the gold standard right now of a special administrative region being controlled by Beijing, it's not a normal Chinese city. So I don't think we know what we're talking about. One final point I'd just add to is it's really useful, and any of you all in the room who've lived in Hong Kong know this. The demise of Hong Kong is the eternal topic in Hong Kong. We're always talking about it there. The figures that you gave, Mark, are discouraging. I suspect they're not unprecedented, though. I would like to see comparable figures in the 1967 riots, and this is, or after SARS and these kinds of periods. I mean, they're probably more severe this time, but still, I think Hong Kong is a long way of becoming a regular Chinese city in any event. Okay.
Thanks very much, Ford. No, I might open this up to open the floor up for others to ask questions. We don't have a spare microphone because they are using it, but so if you could speak clearly.
So, what path do you see forward? The Chinese government's not going to step in because they risk setting off a chain of events. The people are continuing unhappy. They're going to keep stepping up the ante. So what's the path forward?
Yeah, that is the million-dollar question. When I said 6,000 had been arrested since the protests had started, I think there was probably a hope that if they took the protest leaders off the streets, that the protests might fizzle out. Well, clearly that's not going to happen. I think Carrie Lam is actually in Beijing this weekend, making what they call a duty visit. No doubt she'll be read the Riot Act behind closed doors. Whether or not there's any change once she returns, I don't know. There was talk in Hong Kong media the last couple of days that there'd be a cabinet reshuffle. At least one of her ministers has asked to resign, but has been told no. So, it's just a guessing game, to be honest,
Sure. Yeah, a couple of thoughts on that. One is when I speak of the Chinese party organization as a Leninist structure, it often sort of conveys a sense of ruthless and brutal, and it can be. But a Leninist party, by definition, is also extraordinarily practical and very sophisticated. And they're going to look at Hong Kong and they're going to game it at a whole bunch of levels. I mean, no Leninist state lives by repression alone if it can avoid it. You're co-opting, you're by range of benefits, you're deflecting, and you're suppressing when you absolutely have to. And they're going to look at Hong Kong and they're going to say, first of all, fine, let them demonstrate for a long time, let their economy go down the toilet a little bit more and see how they like it. I think it's not. I don't know this, and we'll see when the demonstrations pop back up again, as they inevitably will. But I think the Paula-Yu siege was a really remarkable experience for a lot of Hong Kongers, and distasteful. It's looking into the abyss. Is that what's going to happen? And a lot. You have again that 40% vote for the establishment, even under those circumstances. And I argue that the margin in Hong Kong that can swing back and forth is quite large. I mean, I all do applause to the Pandems for what they did in the district council election, but that's not set in concrete by any means. Beijing also will be trying to find bones it can toss out. I mean, I don't rule out some political thing being offered. Some spin on the investigation of the police. Something like that. Universal suffrage, no way. But they're also looking for what they do focus in. While Beijing has a very hard time recognizing and legitimizing internally the political demands in Hong Kong, it gets the economic situation. I mean, what did they do after SARS and the 2003 demonstrations? They brought in the closer economic partnership, and they just tossed goodies at them. They'll toss more goodies at them. They're also shaking down the tycoons right now. It's not accidental the tycoons are handing over their property to the Hong Kong government to be used for housing construction. That's coming down from on high. And so a lot's going to be happening. Look across the board. There'll be things that you won't immediately recognize as being directed from Beijing that may well be being directed from Beijing. So I think they play this out. They play the long game. They don't want to have to go in there. They know that they own the mess. I mean, they would represent it as restoration of constitutional norms. We're just going in temporarily under the basic law to fix things. We'll get out real fast. They know it's not going to be that easy. Even if there were relatively little bloodshed, it's a big if. It would change circumstances radically. They don't want to go there, so they're going to do whatever else they can to avoid that. And ultimately, they own it. It's not going anywhere.
No, I wouldn't add much to that, except that they do play a long game, and the movement will inevitably dissipate over time. It's just going to happen.
Do you think, as Beijing is tossing the bones out, as President Xi enters his third term in 2022, he will be looking for some form of little trophy back to show to mainland China that Hong Kong is not a success but is under control. Do you think that the third term point will have any impact on Hong Kong?
Yeah, sure. I'm sure he'll want that. Of course they will. And he will. You can bet that he'll represent the political report. That we had these successes, and there may be continuing problems, and we'll recognize that because we're frank and we know our problems. But of course, he's going to. And if they don't have some significant success, they'll find something to dress up as a success. So then this will certainly happen. Right.
Yeah, there's a book that was published about 3 months ago by an Australian academic, Richard McGregor, named Backlash. I guess a lot of you may have read it. It's a small Penguin book, but he outlines just how much control the current president has compared to his predecessors. And so I think he is going to be in total charge of both the messaging that the millions and millions of mainland Chinese get to read and hear and see every day. So, that is one of the other issues that in Hong Kong, freedom of the press is still largely in place. There has been talk over the last couple of years on whether the South China Morning Post is as free as it once was, now that it's owned by Alibaba. I think it is, from my observations. I probably spend up to an hour a day reading the Post. And of course, in Hong Kong, there are a lot of other media outlets which mainland Chinese just don't get to see. There's Hong Kong Free Press, which is a great website. But also, if you just follow the protest movement on Twitter and on Instagram, that can lead you down so many pathways. The challenge that brings, and speaking as a journalist of 25 years, is there's also a huge amount of misinformation out there now. A lot of young people that are arrested, and this particularly happened at the Hong Kong Polytechnic University when people were arrested, was young people calling out their names and saying, "I'm not suicidal." And that's based on so many stories on social media of people that have been arrested. Nobody knows what's happened to them, or of suicides that young people think aren't actually suicides. So there's a lot of hysteria, and that is one of the downfalls in a situation like this, when you have a free media and free social media, that both myth truths and real truths are out there. And it's very difficult for people on the ground to perhaps figure out what's real and what isn't.
But I want to ask a question about whether the Hong Kong government or political elites or business elites and also the younger people, protesters, will change their behavior after the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act becoming effective. Do you think the people's behavior, including the government officials and also protesters, they will respond to that act differently, and you would think? So what would be your comments on that? Thank you.
I think it is.
I think that's at least initially for me. I don't think it's going to have a big impact on behavior. The Hong Kong youth are, of course, delighted with it, but they were already out there with American flags and marching up the Consulate Garden Road and all these things. I mean, for the Hong Kong authorities, who on the really critical issues that would influence U.S. policy decisions are being driven by Beijing. They don't have any wiggle room. And Beijing's going to, for Beijing, it's strictly a marginal issue. They've got much bigger fish to fry, including in their relationship with the U.S. I think it's the passage of the law was clearly a response by the U.S. Congress, reflecting American citizens' concerns about what was going on in Hong Kong. This is what they thought they should do. That's fine. That's a legitimate act of lawmaking by America's Congress. But whether it's going to be effective or not, it's a different question entirely.
Yes, Clifford.
I just have a question following up on sort of a waiting game. Thank you. I just wanted to know how much time do you think that they sort of really have in terms of, could it spread to mainland China? Obviously the rhetoric amongst the netizens on WeChat and the mainland that the protesters are rioters and they don't like them because things in China are great right now. But if there were an economic downturn and these netizens who maybe haven't seen where China has come from to where they are now, if they become dissatisfied with the party and they see that the stuff in Hong Kong maybe isn't still going, but there is a precedent for it to have gone on and to continue going on, do you think that perhaps there really isn't that much time for the party to just kind of let this go on, because it could just inspire movements in the future?
Okay. I don't think there's much chance of that at all, actually. I think that maybe in the Hu Jintao era before 2012, there might have been a bit more of that, the chance of that happening, but not now. I think that what Ford's been talking about, the levels of control throughout the Chinese system are such that it's almost impossible to see that happening. So, in my view, is that they will play the long game and the movement will inevitably dissipate over time. And I don't see any realistic way of that spreading into the mainland at all.
Let me take this little teeny microphone. Yeah, I'd agree with that entirely, Brian. I mean, they've already been on a very high alert. And it's still, Neijin or whatever it is, but then it lacks externally, uptight internally. we have reports of dozens of people, or anecdotally, we being the media is when I'm reading these. And by the way, I'm totally retired. I'm like out of the U.S. government. I'm not sure on my own. So when I say we, I mean, ooh, we've got secrets. No, but it's what I've read articles suggest there have been dozens of people arrested across the country. The British consulate employee claimed that he had heard other people speaking Cantonese being interrogated when he was being held in Shenzhen, right over the border. They're taking this very, very seriously. I mean, in fact, I would argue that one of the two red lines, the knowable red lines for Chinese intervention in Hong Kong would be any sign of a significant sort of infection in the mainland and an organized sense of sympathies for Hong Kong. They won't tolerate that. They'll shut Hong Kong down in a heartbeat if it comes to that. But I don't think it's going to get anywhere near there.
Yeah, I'd agree with that as well. I think, you can see China is just in shutdown when it comes to Hong Kong. I can't see it flooding over the border. What I do see happening, though, is, of course, after the handover in '97, there was a flood of Hong Kong people that had access to another passport leave Hong Kong. And then after about 10 or 12 years, a lot of those people returned, ones that had gone to Canada, the States. So these are very mobile international people who I think will eventually make the decision to leave Hong Kong again. And that will further just, change the face of Hong Kong, because what makes it such a vibrant place to visit and live in is the international feel. Hong Kong's marketing slogan since, I think, '97 was Asia's World City. And you can argue that moniker is now in danger and probably won't be appropriate fairly soon.
Up here.
Yeah, basically says back the rhetoric of that Beijing is goodwilling to Hong Kong, because speaking from a historical perspective, when Beijing's government took over the seats in United Nations Security Council, they started a process to rip Hong Kong from the colonial territory list, so that Hong Kong lost its rights of self-determination to decide whether to join or leave China. And instead of speaking that Hong Kong independence is a dangerous idea by itself, but I think on the other side, isn't that a dangerous warning sign for Beijing to show how federal or how its nation-building approach is so federal and fundamentally in failure.
Me? Sure. Where's that gigantic microphone? How to put this? Fundamental thing, Beijing has zero tolerance in any size, shape, or form for the independence of any bit of it. It still claims Taiwan as part of itself. It claims the South China Sea, or 90% of it, as its own. Internally, in those areas it administers, it has zero tolerance for any expressions of independence. This is part of the official ideology. It is difficult to imagine a leader, even Xi Jinping, remaining in power if some bit of the country were to break off and become independent. It's also impossible to imagine that happening. That's just a fundamental statement. Having said that, and not for sentimental reasons, not like the Chinese leaders are particularly delighted with Hong Kong. I think the harbor's pleasant. They probably do. They want Hong Kong to succeed for their own sake, for the nation's sake. They want to have access to the resources that are there, in particular the financial resources. Also, not to be ignored, this gets into the category of sort of Hong Kong just becoming like another Chinese city. They understand the value of the court system there. Not because they particularly esteem Western style the rule of law, but because they recognize it's useful for commercial purposes. And it's useful for them to have on their sovereign soil a place where companies can go and get proper judicial address of their issues. So I mean, they've got all kinds of very hard-nosed national interest reasons to want for Hong Kong to be successful, even when they have no desire to see it independent.
But there's signs on Beijing's side to place more resource on cities like Shenzhen and Shanghai. place the importance of Hong Kong.
But they can walk and chew gum at the same time. They can do all that simultaneously.
Hello, my name is Yao. This is pretty loud. I'm one of the young people that James mentioned, not from Hong Kong, who thinks quite differently from the young people in Hong Kong today. And through my experience, like growing up in Shanghai and now being in New Zealand, observing all of this, my feeling is that this almost feels like a conflict of religion to me, because like we are in New Zealand talking about Hong Kong, who actually have a lot of similar beliefs to people in New Zealand, like we believe in democracy, we believe in freedom, but actually mainland China, they have a totally different belief system, and not all of it might be embedded in communism. Some might come from Confucianism, some might come from recent history, and like from my observation from medias from both in Taiwan, mainland China, and also in New Zealand, I see the extent of the protest and the behaviours there. I don't believe those will be accepted in any developed country that I know of. And so my question would be, how justified do you think the protest actions are in Hong Kong? Like, to what extent those actions are justified? For example, blocking roads, throwing petrol bombs and stuff, and how much of those are related to the actions of Beijing in Hong Kong, if any, and how much of it is related to this belief difference that we have. And I want to point out that because we are in New Zealand, we feel more connected to the belief in Hong Kong, that we might overlook some the belief system in mainland China, especially given in our belief system. I feel that like the Beijing Communist Party is like the Antichrist, and all of the people are like millions of Antichrists, which kind of paints a different picture, which justifies any action that is anti-Beijing.
Yeah, perhaps I can start. And it's a very interesting question that you've put. I think it is true that as a result of that belief system, people in mainland China place a great deal of importance on stability. I mean, there's a lot of concern at the moment about the surveillance state, the extent of facial recognition and the intrusion of the state into people's lives. But it's justified on the grounds that it makes for a safer society, and a lot of Chinese people believe that. And I think the 40% that you talk about probably share the view that some of the actions of the protesters go well beyond what they would find as acceptable, and they would prefer a degree of stability so that normal social life can continue, and the attempts by the government through the police to secure that are things that they probably support as well. So there is that greater tolerance, I think, for the state to have a role in creating that kind of stable environment, which, as you suggest, differs from the way we might look at that situation.
I'll take this great big microphone. Yeah, thank you. What is that, like Austin Powers? It's first things up front. No, I can't imagine that any proper law-based, well-organized government in the world would endorse or applaud the violent activities that occurred in Hong Kong on either side. My government's been very clear on this. If you read U.S. government statements, there's a constant. By and large, we're doing it right in this administration. Not always happening the right way, but we did it under Obama. For instance, when I was in Hong Kong for 14, we would make general statements. We didn't get into the specifics of what was happening, but we always emphasized U.S. support for peaceful employment of right of assembly and freedom of speech and all of these things. Yeah, would we accept people burning cars down and blocking streets in the middle of New York? No, we don't. We stop it. Municipal police forces stop it all the time. And what you heard in the U.S. and other countries' commentary on Hong Kong in 14 and again this year is the call for peaceful demonstrations by the citizens, and also for the police authorities to use appropriate responses and to avoid excessive use of violence. And when that occurs, as it's inevitably going to occur in big situations like this, for the government to investigate their police officers, which Hong Kong did very well actually in 2014 was our impression. This time I'm farther away from it, I can't follow it as closely. Your observation about differences almost of religion, well, there are profound differences of values. You know, these are things that are really important to people. The Leninist regime is not a naturally Chinese thing. Your governing party imported it from the Soviet Union.
He talked about Confucian.
Well, I was going to get to that. I'm not going to quit using it actually, because it's fundamental to the operation of the state.
Well, that's your view.
Now, well, it is my view. That's why I'm speaking right now. If you want to take the microphone, I'll give it to you. Well, no. No, and I would argue to you that you see a place with particularly strong representation of Confucian views in Hong Kong and in Taiwan. If, sir, you want to talk about Confucian values, they've reemerged in China since the late 1990s after having been abominated with burned books and buried Confucian scholars in times past. Yeah, no, so I mean, it's an opportunistic reaching back to pre-modern values. But I agree, I mean, the Leninist system in China is not the sole thing there. It builds on long-standing institutions of Chinese civilization. I'm quite aware of that. But it is consequential for the behavior of the state and of the citizenry, and the way propaganda is handled out, where the way education is handled. I welcome, by the way, the increased use of the regime in the last 20 years of references to traditional values. I think it's a healthy, positive thing, but it's being exploited for very utilitarian purposes. But in any event, yeah, you do have very different values. And you go to Taiwan, or you go to, certainly, where you have functioning law-based democratic China, clearly culturally Chinese. In Hong Kong, you have an open society, law-based. These are places where those values work equally as well. But the point I zero in on is just there are differences of values, and that's the gap. That was the contrast I was talking about at the beginning of my presentation.
Well, I think on that note, we're going to have to draw the proceedings to a close. We were quite provocative in setting the title for this talk tonight, Towards an Uncertain Future, because the one thing that is uncertain, that is not uncertain, is that there is a clock ticking, and in 2047, the arrangements that were set in train in 1997 will cease. But as you pointed out, Ford, the question is, a lot of it is around the how and the extent. But I think one probably never imagined in one's wildest dreams that things would stay exactly as they were from 1997 to the last day of 2046, so that in 2047 there was some massive change. There is a process going on. But on that note, I'm going to invite Melanie Thornton, our Executive Director, to propose a vote of thanks to the three of you.
So, thank you all very much for a fantastic discussion. Fantastic questions from the audience as well, I must say, and I think that has been very provocative and far-reaching in terms of understanding some of the complexities obviously going on in Hong Kong. So, thank you all very much. We have a small gift of thanks from the Institute. And I'd also like to thank James for facilitating tonight's discussion, and thank you all for coming again. Merry Christmas to you all, and this is the final event for the Institute for this year, but I hope you'll come to many of our events in the following year. Thank you very much.